Good evening. In our session today, I want to take up a particular objection to the reliability of the Old Testament that surfaces with surprising frequency, especially in skeptical and academic circles. It is the contention that the Israelites' 40-year journey through the wilderness, as recorded in the books of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, is historically implausible because, quote, there is no archaeological evidence that it ever happened. At first glance, this seems like a powerful critique. After all, the biblical narrative describes a mass of people, possibly numbering in the hundreds of thousands or even millions, wandering through the Sinai desert for an entire generation. If such a large-scale migration truly occurred, wouldn't we expect to find some trace of it in the archaeological record? The claim seems straightforward. If the wilderness journey really happened, we should find evidence of it, but we don't find evidence of it. Therefore, the journey probably didn't happen. It's a syllogism that appears persuasive, particularly to those unfamiliar with the limits of archaeology or the nature of historical evidence. However, as we begin to peel back the layers of this argument, we discover that it is not nearly as ironclad as it first appears. On closer inspection, the argument suffers from critical, methodological, historical, and philosophical weaknesses. And when we look beyond the superficial claim, we find significant evidence, both indirect and contextual, that not only supports the plausibility of the biblical account, but also illustrates the profound theological depth of what the Bible is communicating. So what I'd like to do is guide you through a carefully reasoned response to this objection, one that upholds both the intellectual integrity of the Christian worldview and the reliability of the biblical text. We'll look at this through 5 essential lenses. The first problem with the objection is that it commits what philosophers and historians call the argument from silence. This is the logical fallacy that occurs when someone argues that because we have no evidence for X, X must not have happened. But this is only persuasive when we can reasonably expect to find such evidence in the first place. To illustrate, imagine I claim that I had lunch in a restaurant on a particular date 5 years ago. You might ask, can you prove it? If I have no receipt, no photo, and no eyewitness, you might say, then I don't believe you. But does the absence of evidence really prove the lunch didn't happen? No, it simply proves that ephemeral events often don't leave lasting traces, especially over long periods of time. Now apply that same principle to ancient nomadic tribes crossing a vast and largely uninhabited desert more than 3,000 years ago. Is it reasonable to expect an abundance of archaeological remains? Not at all. In fact, it's precisely the kind of situation where we should expect to find very little, if anything. This is why, many professional archaeologists, even those not committed to the biblical narrative, are hesitant to draw strong conclusions from what has not been found. The lack of material evidence in this case simply does not constitute a disproof of the biblical account. The second point we must consider is the nature of the people and the environment involved in the biblical wilderness journey. The Israelites, during their 40-year sojourn, were not settlers. They were not building cities. They were not constructing monuments. Instead, they were nomads, intentionally living in tents, moving from place to place as God directed them, often avoiding the established trade routes in heavily populated regions of Egypt and Canaan. And the Sinai Peninsula, where the bulk of this journey occurred, is a formidable landscape. It spans over 23,000 square miles of rocky terrain, steep mountains, and shifting sands. The vast majority of it remains archaeologically unexplored, particularly the central desert regions where the Israelites would most likely have traveled. Now, archaeologists have noted that even Egyptian military expeditions, which are actually really well documented in inscriptions and texts, left virtually no trace in the very same deserts. These were trained soldiers building supply lines, fortresses, and outposts. Yet, physical evidence of their campaigns is, well, scarce or even non-existent. So, to expect a group of ex-slaves with no permanent structures or settlements to leave behind a clear archaeological footprint is, honestly, an unrealistic expectation. Furthermore, what kind of materials would the Israelites have left? Tents made of animal skins, clay pots, organic waste, items that degrade rapidly in desert conditions. And, they weren't staying in one location long enough to build up significant refuse layers that archaeologists typically look for in ancient cities. So the absence of archaeological remains from nomadic Israelites in the desert is exactly what we would expect given their lifestyle and the topography. Now, does this mean the entire biblical account rests on faith alone, without any historical support? Not at all. While we may not have discovered remains directly attributed to Israelite encampments in the wilderness, we do have indirect and contextual evidence that supports the broader narrative of the Exodus. Let me mention just a few important pieces. First, Semitic slavery in Egypt. The Brooklyn Papyrus, dated to around 1800 BC, contains a list of household servants, many of whom have Semitic names. This strongly supports the biblical assertion that a population of Semitic people, likely Hebrews, were living in Egypt in a state of subjugation. It fits the biblical background perfectly. Next, the Habiru in Egyptian and Canaanite texts. Multiple sources from the Late Bronze Age refer to a group called the Habiru or Apiru, often described as outlaws or invaders. While scholars debate whether this group is identical to the Hebrews, the phonetic similarity and sociological role they played align strikingly with the biblical description of the Israelites. Archaeological excavations in cities such as Hazor, Jericho, and Ai have revealed layers of destruction around the time associated with the biblical conquest. These findings are, subject to interpretive differences, and not all align neatly with every biblical detail, but they do establish that something significant was happening in Canaan during the time period associated with the Exodus narrative. Exodus chapter 1 verse 11 refers to the Israelites building the cities of Pithom and Ramesses, which are known from Egyptian records. The mention of these names reflects first-hand familiarity with Egyptian geography and bureaucratic structures, further evidence of the historical depth of the text. In short, while we may lack a singular, definitive piece of evidence that says, the Israelites were here, we have a growing constellation of clues that make the biblical story historically plausible within its ancient Near Eastern context. We now come to perhaps the most overlooked dimension of this discussion, the theological purpose of the wilderness narrative. The mistake many critics make is approaching the Bible solely as a historical document, expecting it to function like a modern textbook. But, the Bible is more than history. It's theological history, a divinely inspired record of God's actions in space and time, told for the purpose of revelation, not merely documentation. And what is the theological function of the wilderness journey? In Deuteronomy chapter 8 verses 2-3, Moses explains it clearly. Remember how the Lord your God led you all the way in the wilderness these 40 years, to humble you and test you, to teach you that man does not live by bread alone but on every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. The wilderness was a crucible, a time of testing, dependence, and divine formation. The Israelites were not building monuments. God was building a people. Their sustenance was miraculous. Their clothes did not wear out. Their food came from heaven. They were surrounded by the supernatural, not the architectural. So, this explains, theologically speaking, why we really shouldn't expect grand physical evidence. The desert experience was actually designed to be a hidden journey, a kind of liminal space between bondage and promise. The emphasis here is on faith, trust, and obedience, not on leaving behind a material legacy. Theologian James Hoffmeyer makes the point well when he says, "The wilderness was not a place of permanence, it was a place of purification." Thus, the silence of archaeology may actually be not a liability but an echo of divine design. Finally, let's try to put this all in perspective. Critics once claimed that the entire Davidic kingdom was a myth, until the discovery of the Tel Dan Stele in 1993, which referenced the House of David. For centuries, skeptics dismissed the Hittites, until archaeologists unearthed their entire civilization. Time and again, archaeology has caught up to the Bible, not the other way around. The desert has not yet given up its secrets. That doesn't mean it never will. But more importantly, the Christian worldview has never insisted that faith be based solely on material remains. Faith, properly understood, is not belief without evidence. It is trust in a reliable testimony grounded in both reason and revelation. When Scripture speaks, it does so from within history but not bound by our modern demand for proof. Its power lies not in leaving artifacts behind, but in transforming the human heart. And honestly, that transformation is evidence no desert can hide. So where does this leave us? Well, it leaves us with a sober and reasonable perspective. The absence of archaeological evidence for Israel's wilderness journey is not a defeater for the biblical account. It is consistent with what we would expect, given the geography, the nomadic lifestyle, the theological purpose of the journey, and the current limitations of archaeology. It also leaves us with a challenge to remember that God often works in ways that defy our categories of evidence and expectation. He did not carve his glory into rocks in the desert, he etched it into the lives of his people. So let us not be discouraged by the silence of stones, for Scripture in its beauty, consistency, and transformative power speaks louder than the sands of Sinai. If this message challenged your thinking or strengthened your faith, don't stop here. Share this with someone who's wrestling with doubts. Let them see that faith in the Bible is not blind. It's built on a foundation of historical reliability, logical coherence, and theological depth. If you're hungry to go deeper into the intersection of archaeology, theology, and truth, subscribe and explore more of our resources. And remember this: Christianity is not afraid of the evidence because the God of Scripture is also the God of history. Keep asking the hard questions, keep searching for truth, and let the evidence lead you home.